She first noticed him at the edge of the dusty county fair, where the Ferris wheel groaned like an old secret and the smell of fried dough mixed with hay and sunburned earth, a man leaning against a fence as if he had nowhere to be and all the time in the world, a drifter cowboy by every outward measure, hat worn thin at the brim, boots scuffed beyond repair, denim faded to the color of the sky just before rain, his posture loose and unguarded like someone who had learned long ago not to expect much from tomorrow, and she would later laugh at herself for how quickly she decided she understood him, because she had built her life on reading people fast and wrong only when it came to herself, and so she told herself he was passing through, another ghost riding the long road west, a man with pockets full of dust and a heart trained not to stay, and yet there was something in his stillness that caught her, a gravity that made the noise around him soften, like the world itself was giving him room, and when their eyes met it wasn't dramatic or cinematic, just a brief acknowledgement, a nod across distance, but it lingered in her chest longer than it should have, and she hated that because she had sworn off men who lingered, men who carried silence like a second shadow, men who looked at you as if they were already leaving, and yet she found herself drifting closer without deciding to, drawn by the quiet confidence of a man who didn't perform for attention, who didn't try to be anything more than what he appeared to be, which she assumed was very little, and she introduced herself first because that was her way, boldness as armor, humor as shield, and he smiled in a slow, almost surprised way, as if people didn't usually talk to him unless they needed directions or trouble, and his voice was low and calm, carrying the cadence of open land and long nights under stars, and he said his name was Cole, just Cole, nothing after it, no title, no story, and she told him hers. And the exchange felt oddly intimate for how simple it was, two names hanging in the hot air like a promise neither of them acknowledged, and they talked about nothing at first, about the fair, about the heat, about how the town hadn't changed much, and he listened more than he spoke, not the polite listening people do while waiting for their turn, but the kind that made you feel seen, and she found herself telling him things she usually saved for late nights and trusted friends, little truths. Half regrets, dreams she pretended were jokes, and he never interrupted, just watched her with those steady eyes that seemed to hold more history than his weathered clothes suggested, and when she asked what he did, he shrugged and said he worked with land, which fit her picture perfectly, hired hand, seasonal work, drifting from ranch to ranch, and she nodded like that explained everything, not knowing how carefully he had chosen those words, because he did work with land, just not in the way she imagined, and when she teased him about being a cowboy without a horse, he smiled again, a flicker of something sad and fond crossing his face, and said he'd had horses once, many of them, and that was the first hint, the smallest crack in the story she was building, but she ignored it, because it was easier to believe he was simple, easier to believe she could enjoy him without consequences, and they spent the afternoon together, walking through booths, sharing lemonade, laughing at small things, and she noticed how people greeted him, how some tipped their hats, how others paused as if unsure whether to speak, and she chalked it up to small-town manners, to his being a familiar face even if he seemed like a drifter to her, and when the sun began to sink and the fair lights blinked on, he walked her to her truck, and there was a moment, that charged pause where something could begin or end, and she almost kissed him, almost let herself step into that warmth, but she pulled back. Because she didn't want another man who would disappear without explanation, and he didn't push, didn't look offended, just nodded like he understood, like he had learned to live with almosts, and he said maybe he'd see her around, and she said maybe, fully expecting that she wouldn't, and she drove away thinking of him as a pleasant interruption, a story she'd tell her friends about the cute drifter cowboy she met at the fair, but the next morning he was there again, leaning against the fence at the feed store when she went to buy supplies for her small rescue ranch, the place she poured all her love into after giving up on people, and he helped her load bags into her truck without being asked, moving with an ease that spoke of strength earned, not shown, and she thanked him, and he said he had time, which made her laugh because men like him always did, and over the next weeks he kept appearing, never uninvited but never coincidental either, at the farmer's market, at the diner, at the edge of her fields when one of her fences went down after a storm, always offering help, always leaving before it felt like he was staying, and she began to look for him without admitting it, to feel disappointed when she didn't see that familiar hat, and he never talked about where he lived, only that he was nearby, and when she pressed, he deflected with humor or silence, and she let it go because she was afraid of what answers might mean, and slowly, without ceremony, he became part of her days, fixing broken gates, sitting with injured animals through the night, sharing meals at her kitchen table where the walls were covered in photos of rescues and losses and small victories, and he studied those photos like they mattered, like they told him something important about her, and one night, after too much coffee and not enough sleep, she asked him why he never talked about his past, and the room went still, and for the first time she saw something close over in His eyes, a door quietly but firmly shut, and he said some things were better left where they were, and she felt a strange ache at that, because she recognized the tone, the voice of someone who had loved and lost and decided never again, and she didn't push, because she knew what it was to build a life around avoidance, and weeks turned into months, and their connection deepened into something neither of them named, a partnership without promises, a comfort without claims, and she told herself. It was safe because he was just a drifter cowboy, a man with no roots, no complications, and then one afternoon everything cracked open when a black SUV pulled up to her ranch, glossy and out of place, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, looking around with the nervous respect of someone entering sacred ground, and when he saw Cole, his posture changed, straightening, his voice shifting into something formal, and he called him Mr. Hale, and the sound of that name landed like thunder, and Cole froze, just for a second, but it was enough, and the men began talking about land acquisitions, about meetings postponed, about investors waiting, about half the state watching for his decision, and she stood there, heart pounding, watching the pieces rearrange themselves into a picture she didn't recognize, watching the drifter cowboy become something else entirely, a man who owned more land than she could imagine, whose signature shaped towns and livelihoods, whose absence had been noticed, and when the SUV drove away, the silence between them was heavy and unfamiliar, and she demanded the truth because she could no longer pretend she didn't want it, and he sighed, a sound like the weight of years, and told her everything in a rush, about inheritance, about empire, about walking away from boardrooms and lawyers and expectations after the woman he loved died years ago, about how loving had cost him everything he cared about, and how he had sworn never to open that door again, choosing instead to live simply, anonymously, working with land the way he always had at heart, not on paper, and she listened, torn between anger and awe, between feeling deceived and feeling honored that he had chosen her space to exist honestly, and she asked why he hadn't told her, and he said because he wanted to be known without it, because he wanted one place where his name didn't matter, where he didn't matter more than the work, and she understood that too well, and in that moment she saw him clearly for the first time, not as a drifter or a tycoon, but as a man who had loved deeply and lost so completely that he had mistaken solitude for safety, and she realized how close she had come to making the same mistake, and the chapter of her life she thought was simple suddenly felt vast and frightening and full of possibility, and as the sun set over the fields they had worked side by side, she knew nothing would be the same again, that loving him would mean stepping into a world far bigger and more complicated than she had planned, but also that walking away would mean denying the truest connection she had felt in years, and the story pauses here, on the edge of that choice, because what comes next is where hearts are tested and healed, and if you want to see how a man who owned half the state learns to risk his heart again, and how a woman who thought she knew him learns what love really costs and gives, make sure you stay with this story, subscribe to the channel, and walk with us into the next chapter where everything truly begins.